그럼 이제 오늘 학술대회 마지막 강연 시간으로 조지 메이슨 대학교 한국 캠퍼스 컴퓨터 게임 디자인학과의 프로그램 코디네이터 맡고 계시는 제임스 브로데릭 교수께서 평화를 위한 게임을 통한 갈등 해결 교육이라는 제목으로 말씀 전해 주시겠습니다. 박수로 맞이해 주시기 바랍니다.
Okay, good afternoon everybody.
Hello.
Good afternoon. I know, I'm awful. I make my students do this every time I start class. I teach a lot of 9 a.m. classes, and I think we all know 9 a.m. is a hard time. And I got that today. I'm the last lecture today, and everyone probably is ready to go home. Your brains are full. So hopefully we can try and go through this. We can keep it interesting, and if we finish a little bit faster, that's probably good news for everybody. So, as said, I'm Dr. James Broderick. I don't have a fancy who I am slide, so just to explain, I'm a professor here at Mason, Korea. I've been teaching here about 3 years. Before that, I worked in extended reality research in Seoul for about a year. And before that, I did my PhD back in Ireland, which was focused on human-computer interaction and serious games. So I've been working in serious games for about 10 years or so in a variety of spaces. And for me, what I find really interesting when it comes to serious games and game technology is it's become so much more accessible over the last 10 years, 5 years, 20 years. When I was a teenager and I played too many games, and my parents were very upset all the time, and they said, "Why don't you look at how to make it?" And I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to learn how to program. I don't have YouTube with thousands of hours of tutorials. I could buy physical books for a little bit too much money and try and teach myself. So in a lot of ways I didn't. I waited until I went to study in university, and then when I studied computer science, I learned how to make games. Then when I was working on my PhD, one thing that I talked about was game engines like Unity, like Unreal, have made games more accessible to people. If you wanted to make a game, even if you didn't have a large amount of programming skill, you could use things like blueprints to allow yourself to make simple games without having that barrier of entry. And what I'm going to talk about today, and my experience with working on this, shows that AI in many ways is that additional removal of a barrier. That if you are interested in making games, AI can in many ways empower you as someone who doesn't have a huge amount of technical knowledge or a huge amount of resources. I think we all know when we look at something like Grand Theft Auto 6 and Rockstar spending hundreds of millions of dollars and hiring thousands of people, if you want to make a game, you probably don't have that much money or people to put towards it. So if we look at AI as a productivity tool, it can hopefully help that a lot. So what I'm talking about today is games for peace, so conflict resolution. And this is something that we all can kind of relate to, because at some point in your life, you've had a conflict. It doesn't have to be a war. It can be a boss that asks you to go to hishik or company party when you don't want to. It can be working on a team and someone doesn't do their job. Someone doesn't carry their weight in a group project. My students talk about this all the time. And when we look at how we can negotiate and resolve those conflicts, we want to start young. We want to start with students. How can they learn how to resolve these sorts of conflicts? What sort of skills can help them there? And then they will take that into their everyday lives, take that into adulthood. So this project started when I had a conversation with Dr. Roland Wilson, who's a professor here in the conflict department. And earlier this year, Mason hosted a Young Trilateral Leaders workshop where young leaders from America, Korea, and Japan came here to learn about conflict negotiation. And as part of that, I worked with Professor Wilson, and we decided to do a talk. I would talk about games teaching people about peace. And we also did a little test of getting ChatGPT to analyze a conflict situation and see how good it was at recognizing conflict compared to these young students. We discovered that it could do a pretty good job at a basic level. It wasn't an expert, but it could catch certain things. But we decided to see how we could take the workshops and conversations that our conflict experts give and turn that into something that can be distributed to schools at large. Because not every school can afford to pay a professor from a university who studied conflict negotiation for decades to come and teach their students. And just because you don't have those resources doesn't mean you shouldn't get to go through that process. So we approached this idea, and back in July, we started putting together this idea about making a peace game to teach middle school students how to resolve conflict or approach these daily situations. So we're a pretty small team. We're 2 professors and 2 student undergraduate research assistants. And we kind of have 2 teams. There's our peace and conflict resolution team, led by Professor Wilson, with Yunbin Cho as our undergraduate research assistant. Their job was the theoretical background. How do you analyze conflicts? How do you teach conflict skills? So they were focused on creating the types of scenarios that we would put the students through in the game. Then on our computer game design team, there's me and Unso Che, one of our students. For her, her main focus was artwork. I am a lot of things. I'm not an artist. I can draw stick figures and that's about it. And I could, in many ways, get AI to make artwork for it. But I prefer to have an opportunity to give a student a chance to work on a project like this. When students are in university, they should have these chances to work on a project, get used to working with people in different areas. And when we can get funding for it, why not? And then I handle the technical side of it. So we decided to put together this process. So we asked the question, why should games be used for peace? Why is this a good idea? And some of this overlaps with topics discussed by Professor Casey, Professor Nam, Professor Doran, everybody. For one, games allow safe simulation of real-world situations. You don't put someone who doesn't know how to fly a plane in a plane, right? We put them in a simulator. And similarly, we can apply that across lots of areas. We don't need to put someone in a stressful real-life situation when we can simulate it in a certain way, that it can create these training moments. Additionally, games are powerful in terms of engagement. Because students or players are making choices, doing things inside of the game, they tend to feel more invested. They pay more attention, they remember more. Whenever I talk about serious games, I give the example, the periodic table of the elements. Many high schoolers have to memorize where the different elements are on the table. And then once you graduate, it's gone. But students and kids learn significantly more and remember it for Pokemon. People know Pokemon? People have heard of Pokemon maybe? So with Pokemon, all of them have different types. There's over 1,000 different Pokemon. And if you ask your kids, they'll be able to name every single one of them, or most of them. They'll know which one is good against the other Pokemon. But they won't know the difference between which element comes first, boron or argon. Because they found it fun, they found it engaging, they wanted to learn. So that can be something that games can be really helpful for. And additionally, engagement in games is useful for empathy. Everyone would agree, we don't like the idea of people suffering. We don't like the idea of people being hurt in conflict. But it's very easy when something's far away to not think about it, to not worry about it. Games can allow us to put people in a situation where they're from the point of view of a victim, of someone suffering, and hopefully improve their empathy. And games have done this. When it comes to games for peace, there's been things like Peacemaker, a serious game made in the late 2000s that aimed to educate people on the Israel-Palestine situation by putting you in the role of decision makers in that space. And even in entertainment games, we have games like This War of Mine, a game that came out of Poland that put players in the perspective of a normal person in a war-torn city. You're not a soldier shooting the enemy. You're a civilian trying to survive, finding food, finding water, having to decide, do you let people into your shelter even though you don't know if they're going to steal from you or if they're going to be the ones to hurt you next. So when we think about games for peace or peace games, there's a few things we want to try and think about or focus on. First of all, that idea of putting people in someone else's shoes. Role play, perspective, allowing people to see a different point of view to what they normally have. This is important from an educational and empathy perspective. Next, we want choices to have consequences. If whatever the player does makes no difference, it's not as impactful. It feels like they made a pointless decision. And games love to give these kind of little decisions of two dialogue options that have the same output. So if we want this to be something that can be impactful and make people think, we need the outcomes to matter. We also want moral ambiguity. It's very rare in the real world that there's a right choice and a wrong choice. It's often many levels and layers of gray, and you're having to make decisions based on whatever your values are. So if we want to make a game that can represent this, we have to try and tie into this moral ambiguity. Though it is difficult from a game development perspective to try and create interesting moral choices that are all quite different while leading to the same conclusion. And of course, authenticity. When you talk about culture, when you talk about locations, when you talk about history, it has to be realistic. It has to be something that reflects the real world. The last thing we need is someone unknowledgeable coming in and making assumptions about what something is like in a different culture or how that situation would be. So these were some things we wanted to consider when we were designing the different aspects of our peace game idea. So, when we think about games, traditionally a lot of games lean on things like war. They teach dominance, resource competition, tactical victory, because in many ways, those are external forms of conflict that are easy to gamify. It's pretty easy to understand, point at the enemy and shoot them. It's a little bit harder to, in many ways, make an interesting, compelling game about having a conversation at a table and making decisions about what will lead to the best war recreation afterwards, rebuilding these locations. So the idea with this peace game was to try and reverse the logic of many of these older game ideas. We want to equip youths to be able to navigate identity-based conflict, social exclusion, and microaggressions. So trying to create a situation where these are everyday situations students might encounter, particularly as the world has become more globalized and we have more and more people living in different countries. We're going to have to interact with people from different cultures. And kids, in many ways, don't exactly know how to handle that until they've been in that situation themselves. We want to be able to build conflict literacy, positive peace, and emotional intelligence. We don't just want someone to make choices and then forget about it afterwards. We want them to think, why was this a good choice? Why did this matter? We want to think about positive peace, this idea where it's not just that everyone's silent and avoiding talking about the problem in the room. We want to build an environment where everyone is engaged, happy, that more idealistic type of peace. And we want to provide safe, repeatable practice for boundary setting, inclusion, and nonviolent problem solving. So again, it's that idea, repeatable. by making something like this in a game that can be given to schools, hagwons, anything we need, you don't have to pay a facilitator to come in and give the talk. You don't have to find partners to role play a situation with each other. Instead, on something as simple as a tablet or a phone, students can go through these scenarios, go through future versions of it, and keep practicing these skills in their own time, at their own pace. Because not everyone learns in the same way or at the same level. It takes time. So our context for why we decided on the particular targets we did is that there's a rising amount of conflict about migration, cultural identity, and peer group boundaries. All over the world, this idea of immigration, this idea of people coming into a community is a hot topic. And particularly how we can act in those spaces is becoming more confusing. For cultural identity, how can we respect other people's culture while helping them to integrate into our own communities? If we have someone coming in, particularly at a very emotionally vulnerable state, like many young people are, how do we support them in those situations? Make them more prepared? There's an increased amount of cyberbullying and meme-based microaggressions. And it's true. The way that conflict happens in schools now is very different to what most of us probably remember. We're at a point in time where everyone has access to basically everyone else in your pocket. And social media has become so common to the point where when I was in high school, it was just starting to happen where people were getting MySpace and Facebook was just starting to be a thing. But now it's uncommon to not have social media. And if you have this access to everybody, people are going to misuse it. There's a lack of emotionally safe spaces to practice conflict responses. We don't really give young people a chance to figure out how to act in these spaces. We kind of, in many ways, don't understand their exact situations, and we don't have the training in many cases to support this situation. And schools often rely on punitive discipline rather than developmental conflict education. If someone is involved in bullying, it's oftentimes going to be that they have to be punished. Because we don't want people to be bullies, because we know the outcomes are so severe if someone is a victim of bullying. But not everyone who engages in bullying does it intentionally. Not everyone is a malicious actor. Some people are making mistakes and need a chance to grow. So by giving them this sort of practice space, we can hopefully teach away those attitudes earlier. And in terms of a gap, there isn't really any sort of digital platform that supports all of these things. We want to try and find something that can model structural violence, cultural violence, and identity negotiation. We want to allow youths to experiment. Ideally, what we're hoping to is to be able to engage with artificial intelligence in this later on, to give more customized output or situations to students, though that's still a future work of this project. And we want to find a way to find a peace game that can fill this gap. So we created a scenario focused on this idea of a new transfer international student coming into a middle school. An all-Korean middle school, and now we have this student coming from the Middle East. They look different. They have a different culture. They have different clothing. They have different religion. It's a very stressful experience for a student coming into that, but also for a classroom that hasn't had those dynamics before, it's difficult on that side as well. So we're targeting a 9th or 10th grade Korean classroom. The conflicts we're expecting is things like language barriers. Someone internationally coming in probably doesn't speak Korean. How do they survive in an environment where they don't understand that, or where they're going to speak it incorrectly as they learn? Identity-based tension. How do we engage with someone in our groups in that space? If there's those communication issues, does that affect their ability to work in groups, to participate in the community? And the ideas of cultural and structural violence. It's not always just going to be, oh, I think you look different. Sometimes it's things like thinking their food smells strange, or not understanding why they wear a different outfit during PE. So the characters we decided to focus on were a teacher who's looking after the classroom, the class president who kind of fills in as this student in a position of authority, a kind student who's kind of there as someone to outreach towards this international edition, a troublemaker, someone who's engaged more so in a kind of not necessarily bully behavior, but has this kind of humor-based authority in the classroom, and our international student, Maran. And in terms of the length, we know that these situations don't happen immediately. The very first situations the students are put in is preparing for the transfer student. It's not just when the student is in the classroom, it's the day before when the teacher tells them that a student is coming, prepares them for this situation. I'm not going to do too heavy focus on this because honestly the conflict part is not my area. But if you want justification that we are doing things properly, we have a lot of theoretical foundations that are the basis for the scenarios we created and the options tied to it. Things like Burton's humans need theory. This is the idea that we need certain things, not just food and shelter, but we need recognition. We need to participate in society. We need a way to express our identity. Galton's conflict triangle is looking at how behaviors and contradictions can inform the relationships between people. Lederach's conflict transformation is about systems and relationships. Again, I'm not going to go into much detail about these because, to be quite frank, it's not my expertise. And that's the thing when it comes to these types of games. I can't make a peace game on my own. I know what conflict resolution looks like, but I don't know the details of it. So I choose to collaborate with experts who can guide it to make something actually useful, actually relevant for people. But we took most of these theories and we mapped it to our scenario in different ways. For Burton, we decided that we needed fulfillment per character. Every character is trying to get fulfilled in some way, whether that's engaging in their new school life, whether it's popularity. We wanted to have the difference between visible and hidden violence moments. Not everything is obvious. Sometimes the classroom violence is exclusion by not being invited to a group chat. We wanted to have our transformation paths coded as choices. Choices are different between choosing to transform, to change, as was talked about earlier, versus maintaining the status quo and trying to avoid these sorts of awkward or difficult situations. The class president and troublemaker have influence in a kind of non-traditional, more informal authority. While a teacher has authority in a classroom, big characters among the students also have a different type of social authority that can be very important. We wanted to have the consequences of repeated exclusion. If someone is forced out of an in-group repeatedly, how does that impact them in their life? And finding ways to prevent anything happening in the first place. So these were our character designs that we created with our student and the kind of different roles they filled in terms of being an emotional bridge, being an authority, having power through humor in the classroom. Each of these characters fills a different role so that they tie into different types of conflict. And that's true in that many ways these dynamics are very, very different between individuals in a group. But onto the game format of it. So when it came to the creation of this game, we decided to make a visual novel style of game. For anyone unfamiliar, visual novel is kind of what it says. It's like a book, but with choices, kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure book. And additionally, you have visual elements, you have sound, you have music, all of these different things. Part of this is that it allows us to focus on the narrative and learning. Students aren't getting distracted by winning the most points in a mini game. they're thinking about what's happening from a story perspective, because that's tied into the learning we're focused on. It also tends to be a little bit simpler, meaning that non-gamers can still interact with this sort of game, even without focusing on their lack of skills or their experience. And it's also just more feasible when you have limited resources and time. Again, we had 2 students working part-time, and one of them is an actual game student, and then we have me, a professor who has a lot of things to do, who can only do so much in a technical perspective. So we were trying to create a game that could be prototyped in about 4 months with as few resources as possible. Additionally, we used a program called RenPy as a framework. It's a Python-based visual novel framework that allowed us to really focus in on the decision-making, the scenarios, and things like that. And this is just a screenshot from the game that we made, introducing Baram, giving the narration about what's happening in the scenario. Over the course of the prototypes, there are 15 decision points across different characters, whether you're playing as the teacher, a fellow student, or Maram. Each of these choices have different focuses. In the prototype, we mostly come down to 2 choices per conflict. There's the transformative choice, where you're choosing to engage with empathy, with trying to create a better environment for the classroom, for the fellow students, and the avoidant scenario. It's not necessarily choosing to be an aggressor, but sometimes choosing not to change, choosing not to be supportive is also a violent act. Decisions accumulate non-linearly, which means over the course of the game, students are making every single choice, and we look at their choices as a whole decision point rather than a failure point with bad endings. This allows for not just this altering emotional climate, but also means that there is a chance for repair. Just because you made a bad decision 1 or 2 times doesn't mean everything can't be fixed. And there are 3 main endings that players get in our prototype. A positive ending, which focuses on structural fairness and emotional trust. A form of mixed peace, where everyone is still engaging in the classroom, but it hasn't really led to positive growth for anybody. And a more negative piece, where Baram hasn't been able to integrate, hasn't been able to engage in the classroom, and is left kind of outcast in this situation. And I just described that. Goes to show what I was thinking about. Now, the AI part where it comes in. We created our script from our conflict team. They created these outlines talking about the context of a situation, what is happening, sometimes hints of dialogue, as well as the choices that were being made. However, this is not enough to make a game. You don't have dialogue, you don't have the visual elements. You mostly just have an idea of what a scene should look like. So, when I got this scenario outline at the start of November, I took that and I used ChatGPT to help me create a rough script for the game. Now, I teach a class on writing at Mason Korea. I can write dialogue if needed. But when you're on a tight frame and you only have so much time, I was able to get ChatGPT to help me do a draft that I could then go in and make changes, make sure everything was consistent, make sure things made sense from the point of view of characters. It was able to then output that in the correct formatting for the framework we used. Now, it's not perfect. Almost every prompt had to be redone and had to be refixed and troubleshooted, but it allowed me to do something that would have probably taken a couple of weeks of work, get done in a couple of hours, which, with my schedule, wouldn't have been possible otherwise. This ability to create quick prototypes without having to have a background was really, really important. And what I think is really key about this is, for me, it's all stuff I can do. I have a computer science background. I've worked in games for years. I can make a game. But with the experience I had doing this, even if I wasn't a programmer, even if I didn't have a computer science degree, I could have still made this game. with the help of something like ChatGPT, with the framework created by these people. It would have taken more time, and over time the game design would be less interesting when you don't have someone experienced and with that creative inspiration. But it meant that this is more accessible to other people. This means that if you're in a classroom and you want to teach your students about something like this, or create these sorts of visual novel and simplified game, you can go and use something like ChatGPT right now. It's not going to be the most creative or the most groundbreaking, but if you're working in this sort of scenario to customize your classroom, does it need to be? And that's the thing that I think makes me most positive when I look at current AI and how it's going to be affecting games and education. From a productivity perspective, it's fantastic. It allows people to get more work done much faster than they could before. It allows people to do things that they couldn't do before. But the thing that makes me cautious is, does everything need to be replaced? When you're working in serious games, there isn't always a lot of money to be found. It's oftentimes quite competitive to get grants, and you're kind of hoping for these things to come up. And when you can use something like this, something like ChatGPT or Claude or other ones, you can make something that couldn't have been made before. And I think that's really important, really useful for these areas where it's not happening in a nearly $200 billion industry. But at the same point, we don't want to reach a point where we forget how to do the things we ask it to do. For me, I'm comfortable asking ChatGPT to do this for me because I know how to do it. It's making it faster for me. It's stopping me doing something I've done 100 times before, or someone has done 100 times before. But maybe I'm looking at my students when I say this, I can do that because I've studied already. So if I don't have ChatGPT, I can go back to the old way. But if you don't learn the basic ideas behind these things, and you become entirely reliant on ChatGPT, well, if that $200 a month subscription becomes $1,000 a month, you might be stuck with that if you've only learned how to interact with it in that way. So, while I think it's really, really powerful for these kind of things, I do urge caution. Just because it can replace your ability to do a task doesn't mean it always should. We want to make sure that we are not just focusing on it replacing us, but enhancing us. And especially with games, I think games are artwork. It's a source of creativity. Even if the focus of this game is education on conflict resolution, I think there's a degree of art inside of that. And I feel like we don't need to outsource that part of it. But in terms of the limitations, again, this is a prototype that was created in about 4 months and the technical part in about 2 weeks. I literally got it finished working this week, so it's been a bit of a tight timeline. Currently, the choices in our game are relatively binary. Most of the time it's 2 choices, and if you have a certain degree of common sense, it's usually pretty obvious which one is the right answer. So one thing we want to improve is to have more of these dilemma type choices, where both options are bad and you have to try and measure what one you can go with. When you have 2 bad options, how do you decide which one is the lesser of 2 evils? Additionally, between the game and the underlying topics, it's a little bit obfuscated. We don't include terms like Baltung's theory of relations or all of these hierarchical ideas. We don't include those verbatim in the game because do you think middle schoolers are going to remember or care about Baltung's theory? Probably not. So for our version, it's focused more on them in action rather than about the specific learning, though it could be tailored to conflict students at university level with those ideas tied into it. But in terms of what we want to do to improve it, and I'm saying this looking at my Dean of External Affairs to say, please give us more funding so we can continue this project. But We want to try and create more complicated decision outcomes, give more opportunity for these decisions to be meaningful to our players. We want to be able to test the game with experts and students to get their actual input, because it's all well and good for me to tell you I've made a peace game. If the experts and students play it and think it's terrible, well, I haven't really created much good at all, have I? And that's why feedback and testing and iteration is important. But something that we really want to try and look at is engaging with AI more. One way to make these sort of decision points more interesting is to not give the players a choice. We give the players a chance to say their own choice. We put the player in the role and we ask them, what would you do in this situation? And if we can engage with an AI reactive system, we can have it analyze what the player has said and say, create an outcome, and tell them what sort of rating their outcome gets. Did they make a good choice? Did they make a medium choice? Now that requires obviously a lot of figuring out, quantifying things, and I don't want to just make an API check to ChatGPT because that feels a little bit lazy. But it's something that can hopefully be really interesting and really good for the future. So, that is what I wanted to talk about now. I know we're technically a little bit ahead of time, but I hope you won't hold that against me, because I'm sure everyone's a little bit tired now. So, thank you all for your time and attention. Hopefully this was something interesting, and always feel free to reach out or come and talk to me after this.
감사합니다, 브로데릭 교수님.